Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss occupied Kashmir. It's been 40 plus days since there's been a communications blackout placed on that region. This, of course, in the wake of the revocation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which gave that region special status within the Constitution. There is obviously international concern about the blackout, as well as human rights violations, which continue in that region as well. Amnesty International has launched a campaign called Let Kashmir Speak, saying that nearly 8 million people in Kashmir have been living through this communication shutdown since August the 5th. I know, in fact, also of many Kashmiris around the world in a diaspora who have not been able to contact their family members back in occupied Kashmir. And for those who have been able to speak to their family members, it's only been for a few precious moments in these past 40 plus days or so. And that too, not everybody has been able to get through to that. So Amnesty, as well as the world, and I can include the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, have all expressed their concern to the Indian government, saying that this block on communication must be lifted, as well as, of course, the many other issues that we can certainly discuss when it comes to issues surrounding Kashmir. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our panelists. We're joined now by Farhan Mujahid Chak, who is the Secretary General of Kashmir Civitas, which is an international civil society organization that advocates for the right to self-determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. He's also Associate Professor of Political Science at Qatar University. He's joining us now from the Qatari capital, Doha. We're also joined by Syed Nadeemul Hasan, who is a Kashmiri himself, who's recently left, in fact, occupied Kashmir. He's also studied an MBA from the University of Wales in the UK. He's currently joining us from Delhi. Nadeem and Farhan, thank you both for your time today. Farhan, I'd like to start with you. 40 plus days of a communications blackout. What are your concerns about what may be happening and why India is keeping this communications blackout in place at this time?
Well, thank you, first of all, Waqar, for having both of us and for raising this issue as much as you do. India is terrified. It's absolutely terrified of what is happening, the internationalization of the conflict. And, for us, for the Kashmiris, whether they're inside or outside, it actually came in many ways of a blessing in disguise that this massive internationalization has prevented what I believe was a well-planned out genocidal demographic change in occupied Kashmir. I believe that one of the first, let's say, actionable items on the BJP agenda with this massive influx of additional troops that now roughly can be anywhere near 1 million Indian soldiers, mercenaries plus, within particularly the valley. So this is the heart of the revolt. So this has, due to the Indian attempt to demographic change and the backlash throughout the world, has prevented what I believe they're still planning on doing. And that's why Genocide Watch has issued an alarming genocide alert. I'm being very careful in my words. I'm being measured. But they have done this. And there are no Kashmiris on this board, right?
Okay, so Nadeem, I wanted to get your thoughts on this too, especially somebody who's just recently left occupied Kashmir. Tell us about your experience and your thoughts specifically also when it comes to the communications blackout.
Thank you, Waqar. Basically, I have just left Kashmir a week ago, and it's the atmosphere of complete grotesque, where Indian forces are applying their forces on us. I mean, if you raise against them, if you raise a voice against them and show any dissent, you're being detained at the same time. Recently, a known urologist from my city, he spoke to some journalists, and a few days ago he was detained as well, and nobody knows where they are keeping them. We heard a rumor that they are being transferred outside the state, probably in Agra or Delhi or Tihar jail for that matter. Nearly 8 to 10,000, kids have been detained who are protesting the revocation of Article 370. So that is basically the case. I mean, everybody at home, we are traumatized and we don't actually know what is coming in the future.
Do you think, Nadeem, at some level that the internationalization that Farhan was speaking of, that has in fact helped the Kashmiri cause in the sense that it may have prevented something a lot worse from occurring?
First of all, I mean, I was listening to the speech that Imran Khan gave yesterday, and he spoke to the RT News yesterday as well. I mean, he has internationalized our cause very much. And apart from that, I had, actually watched news from around the world, somewhere in Switzerland and in England and America, and people are helping our cause. But to my knowing and to my, intellect, I don't think India is bothered about it anyway, because it's been nearly 40 days and we are being denied of basic necessities. That includes the communication blockade. I mean, we are being pushed to the ancient world in this modern type of world. And, the irony is that the people who are celebrating Azadi are depriving us of the Azadi in the first place.
Indeed. Farhan, I wanted to ask you, why does this communications blackout persist at this point in time? This only adds more and more pressure on India's government, doesn't it? And how much longer do you think this will continue? I've seen reports saying that basically Modi wants this in place till his visit to the United States is over, and that will then, at that point in time, after he's returned to India, this blackout may then eventually be phased out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to completely agree with what our guest panelist, our Kashmiri guest has said and echoed. I would just add one thing, that this type of struggle, the struggle needs to be ongoing, continuous, and it's not going to be done in a year or two. What's happened recently, and especially with the new government in Pakistan, I have I've been to Pakistan 2 or 3 times in my entire life. And so I have no political interest in supporting one party or the other. But I can say unequivocally that the government of Pakistan today, being led by Imran Khan, has taken a stand that the Pakistan government has not taken before in many ways. No one's ever said that they're going to be the ambassador of Kashmir as the prime minister of Pakistan. No one in Pakistan has so unequivocally come forward and said that let the people of Kashmir decide. Whatever it is that they're going to decide, that's their business. That's the business of the citizens and those with the ability who have that state subject, verification that they can actually vote in the, inshallah, one plebiscite that will eventually happen. So this is a very opportune moment. And I would even add that the president of Azad Kashmir, His Excellency Masood Khan, is also the type of leader that Azad Kashmir has not had. So sitting back and analyzing these key players, this is a very unique moment. India is afraid. If it cannot walk back from this, it cannot let go, because it knows, once you put a lid on a steaming, fuming public, you lift that lid, it's going to blow. They know it. So they're trying to hope that with time, things will dissipate and there will be less of a furious reaction. They just don't know Kashmiris. Yeah. They're never going to let this go. Not after everything. And our guest panelist from Kashmir is right. This absolute seething fury that is not exploded yet, it's going to.
And on that point, Farhan, if you allow me, I actually want to put that to Nadeem. Nadeem, that's the things that has been brought up recently as well, and I believe Prime Minister Khan also brought that up. But I mean, it's logical if you just think about it, and I'm sure you can confirm this, that this is basically something that will boil over at some point, because Kashmiris cannot just be perpetually suppressed, right? So I wonder where your thoughts are on India says that it's taken this move to combat terrorism and violence of any sort in that region. But does this not actually feed into any sort of uproar and even in a violent way on the part of Kashmiris, who obviously would be frustrated with their situation?
Yeah, I completely agree with with you. Basically, we are Kashmiris and we are living in the same state of hell from the past 70 years. Since my birth, I've seen it all. And I, as a Kashmiri, know for a fact that we are not going to yield. Like you said, that it is boiling and it is going to blast anyway. I mean, the reason the communication blocks are there are because they are not allowing the people of Kashmir to communicate together and to, gather together and protest about it. And even after blockades on communication and everything, we are still fighting our ways. But communication, if they lift the communication block, it's going to blow. it's going to blow the same day. That's why they are completely, traumatized at the moment, and they exactly don't know what to do after that, because they thought if they, block us for a month or so, we may yield. And it has happened in the past, in 2016, after the death of Burhan Wani. Kashmir was shut for 6 months, and we actually didn't feel a thing. And we are going to do that again and again till our, voices are heard. We're not going to yield, that's for sure. And the Kashmiris, as far as I know, we are going to stand together and fight this way through all together.
Farhan, I wonder at some level if this isn't India taking something out of the playbook that Israel even uses towards Palestinians, in that it seeks to provoke a reaction from them every so often, so that it can then have more and more of an excuse when it comes to quote unquote defending itself. Do you think in some way, and I may be wrong on this, so you can correct me if you think so, but that India is actually looking to provoke?
Actually, to be honest, I think that India is absolutely clueless. It doesn't know what it's doing right now. It has totally miscalculated, and it totally misunderstands the Kashmiri psyche. They talk a lot. If you listen to your typical Indian, it's quite amusing. They talk a lot about what they think the Kashmiri psyche is. They invent a lot, and they're delusional to an extent that I really think, and you'll forgive me for saying, that few other people are delusional as much as this. When it comes to usurping another identity and denying someone else their right to express their own being. But they are completely lost in what they're doing. You can manage, but you cannot manage what's happening right now in Kashmir. So even if the argument is put forward that they might want a reaction, they want a reaction typically, even if we follow that line of thought, that they can manage. But what they should have learned in more than the 70 years of the current struggle, but this struggle really goes far back into 1846, and some people even taking far back than that. But you cannot manage a people that do not want to submit. And the reaction has just increased over the decades. It's heightening, it's accelerating. So this is why I think in this last-ditch effort, this extremist government has thrown everything to the wind and decided on their, and it's a grotesque term, but they've used it, final solution for the people of Kashmir. But inshallah, it's not going to work. And the big difference between, if you compare what the Israelis have done with the Palestinians, is that this is not 1947, that you can kill up to 200,000 to 300,000 people in Jammu and push 500,000 into Pakistan. You can't do that now. So the valley is, where are the people going to go? There's 8 million people there. So they cannot make these demographic changes without mass slaughter. And so they can't push people out into China or towards Azad Kashmir or towards the south from Jammu to Sialkot. You can't do it. So that's a major difference than the situation in Palestine, where the Palestinians were sent to Jordan, to Lebanon, to other neighboring countries, diluting the population within occupied Palestine, and then making up the camps. It's a very different demographic and a very different geographical space in Kashmir.
Okay, and that's a very good point to end off on. We're going to have to leave there as no word, but of course we appreciate both Farhan and Nadeem for their time today, and of course for sharing their thoughts and their insight on this important issue. Viewers, as I said, 40 plus days of a communications blackout, no end in sight really when it comes to that blackout, even though now the international community is increasingly calling for that blackout to be lifted, for Kashmiris to be allowed to speak for themselves. So far, we've only already heard the Indian government continuously say this is a good thing for Kashmiris. But Kashmiris, as you can tell, do not agree with the Indian government and really want their own voice to be heard when it comes to their right to self-determination, A, and B, to the human rights abuses and other abuses that they are currently and have in the past gone through in that region of occupied Kashmir. We'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a political report that came out about Israel spying on the current White House, the Trump administration, through surveillance devices, cell phone surveillance devices that were found near the White House and other sensitive locations across Washington, D.C., according to 3 former senior U.S. officials. And obviously, there has been immediate denial by the Israeli government. Even Donald Trump has downplayed the possibility of this occurring. And that, in and of itself, is something that many people say is surprising, in not that the Israelis spy on the U.S., but the fact that Trump has downplayed this and has not reacted in any substantive way to these reports to hold the Israelis to account about why exactly they may be spying on the United States at this time, especially with a president like Donald Trump, who is in office, who is so pro-Israel and so on the side of the Israelis versus everybody else. To discuss that a bit further, we're now joined by Brian Frydenborg, who is a freelance writer, academic, and consultant. He's originally from the greater New York City area, but he's joining us right now from Boston, I believe. Brian, thank you for your time this morning. What are your thoughts about the Political report, about the denials? I mean, I imagine it's not surprising that Israel would be spying on the White House.
It's absolutely not surprising. And by the way, thanks for having me, Waqar. I appreciate it. But yes, I mean, for one thing, this is Donald Trump, and he's not surprising in this sense. Often he is, but he very much is in the side of Israel when it comes to these situations. But yes, so he is very close to Netanyahu, and he very much is trying to assist in Netanyahu's re-election. In fact, the amount of interference in the Israeli election in this situation, as opposed to, say, Russia interfering in our election, is rather unprecedented, just as Netanyahu's interference in the 2016 election in terms of play favorites, and there was an Israeli firm that was spying on Obama administration officials. Those are some reports from a while back that confirm that. So they're kind of in this, what I call a sick symbiotic relationship, where they're each encouraging some of their own worst tendencies. And the idea that Trump would give Netanyahu cover right now to be able to simply say, oh, I accept his version of events, actually similar to how we accepted Vladimir Putin's flat-out denial of election interference in 2016 as well, is absolutely not surprising.
I wonder where you make, if I may come in, Brian, pardon me,
Sure.
It's about the timing of all this, because, the biggest time around when the Israelis were reported to have been spying on the White House was during the Obama administration, and especially at the height of the nuclear deal talks with Iran, which obviously the Israelis were against even at that time, as they are today as well. And they were looking to try to find information to try to create obstacles in the path of that deal being reached. But now, with the likes of Donald Trump in office, do you think it's also a lot to do with the fact that Trump has made an overture of some sort to the Iranian president, again, that he may very well want to meet him on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly? Is that what the Israelis fear?
Well, definitely the Israelis fear that, but I would say that with a leader as mercurial and unpredictable as Trump, if you're the Israeli government and you are able to spy on him easily, because this president uses unsecure cell phones, does wherever he wants, ignores security procedures, it's actually incredibly easy. And we know that the Chinese are doing this. It's certain that many other countries would be attempting to do the same as well, even allies. I mean, we got caught spying on Germany, but I'm sure there's a lot of back and forth that happens between allies as well, just so they can be informed of deliberations. Winston Churchill was famously spying on FDR during World War II, for example. But they are nervous about it, but I think it's more a general desire to have intelligence on Mr. Trump, on what he's saying, on what his advisors are saying, because he is very easily manipulated. The right turn of phrase, the right flattery can all of a sudden have him change his positions on the dime. So the more information the Israelis have, the better prepared they're going to be to manipulate him. And even during the Obama administration, they were very they weren't hiding the fact that they were spying on us, because they would say things that were so obviously garnered from intelligence gathering about private deliberations that officials were taken aback. And I think the caution that Israelis should be taking from their own perspective here is that when they work with too heavy a hand and they make it a little bit too obvious that they're playing hardball with allies like ourselves that might work with Trump, but there are officials who will be very offended by that, and it will harm the working relationship, as we see now with officials who are choosing just before the election to leak this information to the press that, yes, it was Israel that was caught spying. So I think this is a pushback on professional bureaucrats who believe in norms, who believe in having certain established procedures, trying to call out Netanyahu and Trump for their break with precedents.
It's
and to be
interesting.
fair, the Israeli there were Israeli officials who did the same and leaked things about Netanyahu and what he was doing as far as exaggerating intelligence with the Iranian situation as well to push back against him. So these unconventional leaders are seeing pushback from their own officials is part of the narrative that's being missed.
And, it's interesting for me, Brian, to look at the narrative now on the part of American Jews, because, they're all always lumped into one grouping. But I imagine that's unfair, obviously, because a lot of them are now questioning a lot of Israeli actions, even just within the United States and otherwise. So I'm going to go to a statement of Dylan Williams, who's the vice president at J Street, as you well know, a prominent Jewish American organization. And he said this spying was, and I'm quoting him now, one hell of a thank you note to American taxpayers for the $3.8 billion of our money that goes to Israel every year. And he's referring to the cost of these spy devices, because a lot of the officials that have been anonymously quoted by Politico said that these devices aren't cheap. So there are very few countries out there who would actually be willing to spend the kind of money that would go into putting these sorts of devices out. And Israel likely would be one of them because, again, it can probably afford to because of American assistance again. So this is sort of an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Well, I would be careful on a few levels. I've questioned some of the reporting here in terms of the analysis, not the facts. So Vice was the outlet. I'm not questioning them, and they put a price tag on one of these devices at about $150,000. I think for any government, including in Pakistan, including countries far less powerful than Pakistan, $150,000 to be able to get inside thoughts on a sitting U.S. president is not going to be viewed as that much of an expense. Sure, they're not cheap, but this is spycraft, and national security is always a priority. So I think a little bit is being made of the cost. Now, access to those devices and knowing how to use them, that's a whole other thing. I think that's partly why they were able to narrow it down to Israel. But I don't... This kind of stuff happens all the time. What's different is how Trump has reacted. What's different is the timing before an Israeli election. In terms of the thank you and all that, I do appreciate some of that in terms of how the U.S. actually is doing a lot for Israel. Let me rephrase that. They're doing a lot for the Netanyahu government. And in terms of you talking about the dissent of American Jews, there's an old saying, something along the lines of you get two Jews together and you're going to hear four opinions. It's incredibly diverse community with a lot of robust debate going on, especially in the United States. In Israel, the right wing really has taken over pretty much everything. Liberals are dwindling, but there's certainly a lot of dissent there. But especially in the United States, I think what a lot of American Jews are going to be talking about is how upset they are that this is what Israel's doing. At the same time, I actually think this helps Bibi Netanyahu in his re-election campaign, because he says, look, I'm going to deny that we're spying, but we all know that we do this. And look at my great relationship with Donald Trump, who basically says, I don't care, you can get away with it, I trust you anyway. So I actually think in a kind of sick way as far as international norms go and the way these things are supposed to develop, this really helps Netanyahu. What would have been normal would have been the United States to say, well, we're not going to comment on an ongoing investigation into espionage. And then behind the scenes, there would have been some kind of a quiet rebuke. Instead, we have a public, basically, you're fine, I don't care, from the president. And that is what is so unprecedented. And the fact that he has done this also with a country like Russia, who is absolutely not an ally of the United States, really makes this part of a disturbing pattern.
One other thing which struck me, Brian, is the author of the political story, Daniel Lippman, is obviously standing by his reporting. But at the same time, Amos Yadlin, who is a former Israeli intelligence chief, has actually tweeted in Hebrew saying that this political report is anti-Semitic. And, we know that this label of anti-Semitism is a very sensitive one and is used as a weapon very often when it comes to any talk or any criticism at any level sometimes of Israel. Certainly there is actual anti-Semitism that takes place. But then what do you make of the entire issue of anti-Semitism, how it is used in such context?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because right now in the United States, we're seeing a surge of anti-Semitism that has not happened at this scale in an extremely long time. And I would refer everybody to Barry Weiss of the New York Times, who is both a staunch supporter of Israel and a staunch critic of the Netanyahu government. And the way that Netanyahu and Trump are politicizing the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which for a long time has been, in the eyes of many and certainly policy-wise, a bipartisan thing, where they're trying to make it sound like, look at Ilhan Omar, look at Rashida Tlaib, look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, oh, they're anti-Semitic because they criticize Israel, and that's the entire Democratic Party. And I would point out, whether or not you agree with what those congresswomen have to say, they are a small, tiny fraction of a wing of the Democratic Party that is not in the leadership of the party and does not speak for the majority of the party when it comes to Israel. Having said that, about half of Democrats, and that's been a huge amount of movement over the past few decades, are very unhappy with Netanyahu, with the Israeli government, with their policies towards the Palestinians, as are American Jews. So in terms of anti-Semitism, there definitely is a rise in anti-Semitism globally, but also in the U.S., which is perhaps the most surprising to many. But this defense chief tweeting out that this is an anti-Semitic anything is pretty absurd. However, this has become pretty standard in certain Israeli circles and certain right-wing American Jewish circles, where they circle the wagons around Israel and they play hardball and they go with the anti-Semitism card. And I don't want to make it sound like this is not a serious problem. It is. But in this particular case, it's really hard to make that argument. Yeah. And there are plenty of people in Israel who feel that, and in the United States that are Jewish, that feel that label is overused, just as there have been debates about the Holocaust being invoked too much in Israel. And they even tried to have a bill to limit the use of the Holocaust in public discourse. So in this particular case, anti-Semitism is not really warranted as a charge.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word. Brian, I do sincerely appreciate your time this morning speaking to us there from Boston, and of course for your insight. As Brian there was mentioning, viewers, this issue of anti-Semitism, as I ended off with him in my last question, is one that I feel is used a bit too much. Not to say that anti-Semitism does not occur, but as he also mentioned, ironically, at the time that the U.S.-Israel relationship is probably the strongest it's been in quite a while, there is a growth of anti-Semitism in the United States specifically. What does that mean really about the U.S.-Israel relationship between Trump and Netanyahu specifically, or just between the two entities, the special quote-unquote relationship they'll always talk about? If it's so special, why does Netanyahu need to send out spy devices to spy on Donald Trump, who's basically given him carte blanche to build settlements, to annex, and to move the capital to Jerusalem and otherwise? A lot to digest there, of course, and specifically, of course, again, in the context of the fact that Israel receives $3.8 billion of taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer money, on a yearly basis. And that's, of course, according to J Street, which, as I said, was a prominent Jewish American organization. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. In the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss immigration at the U.S.-Mexico border, to be specific, and the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States has allowed Donald Trump to temporarily enforce a rule that would deny asylum to pretty much all migrants arriving at that southern border, as that, of course, goes through legal processes of different sorts and the many challenges that have been put forth legally to that rule. The policy denies asylum to anyone at the U.S.-Mexico border who passes through another country on the way to the United States without first seeking asylum there. Now, the migrants who make their way to the U.S. overland would be largely ineligible, along with people from Africa, Asia, and South America. Now, obviously, those on the pro-immigrant side are saying that the Supreme Court is sentencing people to death. There are no safeguards, no institutions to stop this quote-unquote cruelty. Obviously, we know the Trump argument to all of this, and that is to secure the homeland and that you cannot just have a free flow of people over the borders. Let's discuss this a bit further, we're joined now by Iván Pelcastre, who is a PhD in political science and international studies from the University of Birmingham. He's joining us now from Warsaw. We're also joined by Matt Snape, who is executive director for Parliament Street and journalist for Italian publication Inside Over, and he's joining us now from Evesham in the UK. Iván and Matt, thank you both for your time. Matt, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of even this temporary allowance for Donald Trump to enforce this rule? It's been condemned pretty much across the board.
I think what we need to remember is that Donald Trump was elected on a promise to curb immigration, and even though he's found it really difficult to build his border wall, he's trying to do all he can now to create what one publication I read referred to as an invisible wall on the US border. What I do disapprove of, though, is the way that US federal courts think that they have a right to interfere in government policy. I mean, when Barack Obama was US president, he had 20 injunctions put against him by the federal courts. And since Donald Trump became president, it's increased to 40. I think if any US president wants to ensure that they can get their policies through without the federal courts disrupting them, then the US government needs to try and find a way to stop federal courts from doing this, because I'm pretty sure this is not what the founders of the US Constitution intended hundreds of years ago.
Iván, I wonder what you make of that argument, because then imagine the other argument would be made that what of human rights, what of the moral authority of the United States as the land of the free, etc.?
We have to consider that this is not the first time that the United States establishes this kind of agreement with another country. Canada has already signed one in 2002 and implemented it in 2004. Mexico has discussed and rejected implementing this kind of deal with the United States before. And now we're seeing a situation in which we have a national discussion, a debate between federal courts in the United States, but also an international discussion between Mexico and the US, in which Mexico is reluctant to implement these kind of agreements. Therefore, we are having a two-sided debate within the United States, as well as two-sided debate outside the United States. We have to consider this.
Okay, so then if Mexico is not willing to play ball in all of this, do you think it is the place of the United States to sort of just place all of this on Mexico's head and say, listen, now it's your problem? That's not, again, I keep going back to the American ideals, because that's what the rest of us around the world have been sold about America, isn't it? That it's the land of the free, that it takes in the persecuted, etc.
Well, absolutely, and that is one of the great things about the United States. It's obviously a nation founded on immigration, and they are the backbone of the United States. In many ways. But I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is it's trying to distinguish between economic migrants and genuine asylum seekers. And that's where the US government needs to do better, frankly, in terms of identifying the difference between the two. Rather like here in Europe, we've had the same problem since 2015, whereby we've had refugees flee here from the Middle East, and we've not been able to distinguish between who are genuine economic migrants and who are asylum seekers. In terms of the US interfering, trying to come to an arrangement with Mexico, they've got to be careful, because obviously Mexico is a sovereign territory and they do have their own immigration policy. But equally, Donald Trump was elected on a promise to curb illegal immigration, and there has got to be some sort of cooperation between the two countries. I'm sure Mexico is perfectly capable of providing the same sort of opportunities that these economic migrants or refugees, whatever they class themselves as. But there has got to be more cooperation, and there's got to be a better distinction between a refugee and an economic migrant.
Okay, so Iván, let's talk about refugee versus economic migrant, because that's an argument that's brought up a lot, and I've seen that a lot when it comes to this issue of migration around the world, including in Europe. How do you respond to that? Do you think it's fair to say that, listen, we need to distinguish between economic migrants and refugees / asylum seekers who genuinely are pursuing persecution, or do you think that there needs to be less of these titles placed on each person who is seeking asylum or refugee status for their own reasons?
I think we all understand the discussion or the debate around economic migration and other kinds of migration. But I think in the case of the Central American countries, Mexico and the United States, it's difficult to do these hard differentiations. For example, if we think that some of the people that are escaping now from Central America to the United States are facing not just poverty, but also actual prosecution, not by governments, but by criminal gangs, which are taking over their businesses, which are taking over their means of sustenance. Are these really economic migrants, or are these people who have been forced to flee the area because the state has been unable to provide safety? Therefore, we cannot harshly identify these people in one or another category. Moreover, we have to consider that sometimes the states are unable to provide safe haven. The United States is trying for Mexico and Guatemala to provide safe haven to these countries, but it's difficult that they will be able to do so, considering the weak institutional frameworks that exist there.
Okay, so Matt, one of the issues that comes up when on this topic is that if we're talking about the Supreme Court, now we obviously have a Supreme Court in the United States which is very much now leaning conservative, and that is why many people would argue it did allow for this temporary enforcement of this rule as the other legal challenges, and those work their way through the different courts in the U.S. Do you think that that will be problematic then going forward when it comes to then even just basic human rights for many of these migrants who have made it into the United States or are in detention facilities of some sort? Because as you well know, there are many concerns about the human rights of just children, et cetera, of those being kept in cages, really.
Well, absolutely. It's appalling to think. I mean, if I was a father, I wouldn't want to think of my child being separated from me in a cage in particular. I mean, this is a situation that has got to be resolved as quickly as possible, really. In terms of the Supreme Court's reach, though, by having more conservative judges on there, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a US president has stuffed the Supreme Court with judges, essentially, to help push through what they want. But equally, I think the integrity of the Supreme Court needs to be preserved. If that is the decision of the Supreme Court, then it should be respected. And as I say, Donald Trump was elected on a promise to curb immigration, and he's got to be given a chance to do it. And if the voters don't like it, then in over a year's time, they have the opportunity to remove Donald Trump from office if they don't like his policies. As for the human, I mean, I do agree with Iván. There are a lot of human rights abuses in these countries, and that's where the US government needs to do better to distinguish between refugees and economic migrants, because I don't deny for a minute there are people in these South and Central American countries who genuinely need help.
Okay, so, one of the dissenters on this issue is Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who in her dissent says, and I'm quoting her now, "It is especially concerning that the rule the government promulgated topples decades of settled asylum practices and affects some of the most vulnerable people in the Western Hemisphere without affording the public a chance to weigh in." Now, obviously, Matt is correct in the sense that, Donald Trump was, of course, elected and does have a significant support base within the United States. But do you think all of the above supporters are on board with the kinds of human rights abuses and the kinds of strict rules now being placed at the U.S.-Mexico border?
I think it's fair to say that the Supreme Court has to deliberate on this issue, not only on the basis of the legal battle that's taking place within the United States, but also considering the tradition of the United States of providing asylum to people who are under prosecution. In the end, these people are suffering consequences of decades of poverty, criminality within their countries, and this is a desperate situation. Should this legal dispute continue over time, it's not only just a matter of rules which are being discussed, it's people who are at the moment fearing for their lives and probably will not only suffer from poverty, but also will lose their lives. So what we are thinking or what we are considering here is that these two judges, Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg, are trying to protect is the tradition of the United States as a refuge for people prosecuted. That's what they are defending, and I think that principle will probably stand.
Indeed. All right, we'll have to leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate Matt and Iván for their time speaking to us there and of course sharing their valuable insight with us on this issue. Viewers, obviously the Supreme Court has now at this time just given a temporary allowance for this enforcement of this rule, but considering it is conservative leaning and it can probably veto a lot of the other rulings that courts around the country reach through the various legal challenges brought forth against these Donald Trump immigration rules, one can probably guesstimate that this will still be some form of the status quo going forward now at the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexico obviously is not accepting this, lying down, saying it doesn't want to play ball. It doesn't want to be taking care of all these people who it has not also asked for to come into its country at this time. And what have done the U.S. and its moral authority as it's sold to all of us around the world, which I'd put to one of our guests, does this bring into question how free, fair, and really humane the U.S. is now as a nation? If people continue to support Donald Trump in this regard, what does that then say about the American nation as a whole and the American people? We'll keep a very close eye on that, and we'll see, of course, how this immigration issue continues to play out there in the United States of America. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.